in esoteric. So I don't know why this kid chose to call himself Azrael, but it's part of a new series I'm going to be doing for you, right? Where instead of chasing clout and going around talking to other YouTubers and doing that clout swapping thing that you're supposed to do on YouTube, I'm actually going to go off and find and validate real interesting people for you and then bring them to you so that they can teach you about stuff. And that way, that way we can see how we get on. So yeah, at the end of this, it will literally just be the interview presented. But if you guys have any questions for Azrael, the 20-year-old genetic engineer, not Azrael, the archdemon from the Kabbalah, then please post them in the chat and I'll make sure to pin them on the screen and ask him about them. But just bear with me. We're waiting for him currently to come through. I guess I can give you guys a little preface about why I'm interested in this stuff, right? For billions of years, DNA has shaped life on Earth. If you're someone like me who's interested in things like race and identity, you're inevitably going to cross paths with DNA as a concept. And we could talk about nurture and nature, and we will, but we're going to grill this kid about it later. But for the first time ever in human history, we are holding the pen. Like, I am the captain now. We, as people, we're no longer slaves to our genetics. There is a biological revolution taking place, and you don't really hear about it. Like, if you put genetic engineering in on YouTube, just type genetic engineering into YouTube, and you'll see there hasn't been a decent video about genetic engineering with anything new or interesting in it for about 5 years, 4 or 5 years. That lady's speech the CRISPR speech was like a year ago. Okay, let's see. Azrael. Hello, sir.
What's going
on? Not much, man. Not much. I'm just sort of wrapping my head around. I'm not gonna lie. I don't know enough about this. I feel underqualified to interview you. But can you just turn your mic up a little bit?
How would I adjust it? Not the most familiar with StreamYard.
Okay, I don't actually sound a bit better now. If you guys can hear me and you can hear him in the chat, just put a 1 in the chat because that would help me massively with what I'm trying to undertake here. Okay, so Azrael, as I was trying to get across to the audience, like, DNA has kind of shaped life for billions and billions of years, and still the average person understands very little about it. Case in point is me. Like, a lot of this you're going to have to explain to me like I'm a 7-year-old, if that makes sense. But I guess first we'll get to know you a little bit. Who are you, dude? How did you get into genetic engineering? And I guess more specifically, how did you get into it at such a young age?
Well, I mean, from a very young age, I was always into things like Jurassic Park. And it kind of inspired me to look into the field. And while I was looking into the field, the biohacking community was starting to come to its fruition in the early 2010s. Companies like Cambrian Genomics were popping up in places like Silicon Valley, and they were making promises of 3D printing DNA, et cetera, to make designer organisms, and that really piqued my adolescent mind. And so going from there, I looked into the biohacking community more and more. I discovered people like Josiah Zahner, David Ishii, Elliot Roth. These are all people that are extensively known in the biohacking community. Gabriel Licinia. And these are people, David Ishii's working on making genetically modified mastiffs that glow in the dark. Gabriel Licinia created a gene mod that allows humans to have night vision, but it also turns your eyes completely black.
Whoa, okay, wait, stop, just for a second. We have to go way back before we can go forward. My audience is not dumb by any stretch, but in terms of scientific, technical, I would say my audience is smarter than me. Right, the average audience member. However, there's some retards in there, don't get me wrong, but most people will be capable of grasping these concepts. It's just they will have to have them explained a little. Can we just start at the fucking beginning? Dude, what is genetic engineering?
So genetic engineering is in like the synthetic sense, or genetic engineering as a baseline?
No, literally, what is genetic engineering? What do we mean when we say to edit genetics?
Just artificially modify it, whether that's selective breeding, like you're taking 2 dogs that have traits that you like and you're breeding them together. You've got two
Hmm.
cool plants that you want to breed together, or whether you're physically going into the genome and cutting out pieces or popping in new pieces from a different species. Or if you want to get really funky with it, creating entirely synthetic genes or even xenonucleotides, is like alien genetics.
Amazing. Okay, okay. So at a very small level under a microscope, what are we using to edit genes? Chemicals or literal lasers and microscopes? Like, how are we editing genes?
So there's a myriad of different ways. Back in the day, like in the 70s through 90s, they used to use what are called restriction enzymes. They're little
Okay.
proteins that work like scissors, and essentially these scissors will only cut certain letters in DNA. So
Yeah.
as we learned in biology class, ATCG, right? Adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, those are the building blocks of life. And so these restriction enzymes, these little scissors, they'll go in and maybe they'll only cut T's or they'll only cut A's. And essentially how it would work is like copy and pasting words from a newspaper to compose a greater paragraph. And so you would go in with this pair of scissors, you'd cut this section, you'd go in with a different pair of scissors, you'd cut that section, and then you'd copy and paste what you wanted into the thing that you were going to put it in. And it was a very crude method. And then as we get
Hmm.
into the late 90s, we get to a thing called talons, which is a protein mechanism. And it's a lot more complex than just using these enzymes. With talons, you can essentially program the protein in a lesser extent to essentially go in and cut out select genes. Think of it like giving a robot instructions. You give it the program, it'll go in, it'll remove this gene or pop in that gene, right? So that's a little bit more
Right,
complex.
right, 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 right. Yep, 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 yep.
When we
Now,
get
people say that people are suspicious of some of the vaccines, right? And they feel like the vaccines have this technology in them. Can you just confirm off the rip that that's not the case?
so vaccines, some vaccines do require genetic engineering to produce, but
Huh.
those vaccines don't genetically engineer you. So if you ever see something with the
Right, right,
word
right.
recombinant in it. The word recombinant means they're taking a gene from one species and putting it into another species so they can mass produce it. So if you're a diabetic, recombinant insulin would be the human insulin gene that they've put into bacteria or yeast because they can get the bacteria or yeast to produce a lot of it. So while it is true that like these vaccines, a lot of them do require genetic engineering, it's just so the antigen, the actual viral capsid, the protein, the envelope of the virus. It's that's being produced in something else so they can mass produce it instead of literally farming a virus. I think that's where a lot of the
And
misconception comes from.
yeah, got it, got it, got it. And the method that you outlined previously, like this, the most modern and current way of doing it, is that how CRISPR works? Like, can you just explain CRISPR to me like I'm five?
Yeah, okay. So CRISPR starts, it was originally the bacterial immune system because every day in the
Hmm.
ocean, there are trillions upon trillions of bacteria, and they've been at war for billions of years with what are called phages, which are just bacterial viruses. And so much like how you and I have an immune system, and our immune system fights off bacteria, viruses, parasites, the bacterial immune system needs to fight off these phages. And so what CRISPR does is it goes through your genome, which is all of the DNA in your cell, and it'll scan
Hmm.
through it and it'll look for specific markers. And if it doesn't see those markers, it'll cut it into pieces. And so what humans did was they saw, hey, this is a very efficient way for cutting up DNA, identifying DNA, and putting DNA into a system. What if we retrofit that and take advantage of it? What if we steal this system and use it for our own benefit? And so then what they did was they modified the CRISPR proteins to then be able to take a human sequence instead of the normal original bacteria sequence
Fuck, yeah, yeah.
and pop in whatever you want, whether it's coming from a bacteria, a fungi, a bird, a snake, an eagle.
So we could take the sequence that makes a bioluminescent mushroom bioluminescent and then put it into a person theoretically.
So funny you bring that up. There's a company called Light Bio based out of the US that took the genes for bioluminescence out of a mushroom and they put it into petunias. You can go online right now if anyone wants to open their browser, go to BioLight, and you can buy bioluminescent petunias for $15.
Based. Okay, that's hella interesting. That's hella interesting. Okay, we'll get more into the kind of ethics of this a little bit later and the kind of playing God and the whole magical side of what it is you do. But do you want to just, for the audience's sake, explain how the fuck someone who's 20 years old got into this? I mean, obviously your background and your level of understanding is much higher than the typical bio class that you would take, even at university. So are you self-taught? How did this, like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, so when I was about 13, I got my first angel investor, and I was doing the. Are you familiar with the Aqua Advantage
Wait, no, no,
salmon?
no, wait, bro. This is the thing. We have to go step by step. How the fuck does a 13-year-old get an angel investor? Dude, I can't get angel investors. You know, and what do you mean? Like the fuck?
Okay, so the background for that would be the Aqua Advantage, which is the genetically modified salmon that grow really, really big, really, really fast. The patent
Okay,
for that, it's from a Canadian company, had expired in the US. And it was only
right.
going to be there was a 3-day gap where you could refile for it. And so I made a few posts as a 13-year-old in some of the biohacking forums. And I was like, hey guys, it's a very simple construct. I know I'm young, but here's all the money I would need. Could we do a group buy so I could make some genetically modified salmon? And a bioethics lawyer out of California decided to
Bruh.
send me $1,000 so I could get my gene constructs as plasmids, lyophilized from a place called GeneScript out of Shenzhen, China. And
As you
then
do,
those,
yeah, standard,
yeah,
yeah, classic. Fuck, keep
those got
going.
those got shipped to my house, and then I went on a website called Government Deals. Well, it's govdeals.com, and I bought a bunch of older lab equipment from the U.S. federal government. Particularly, I bought an electroperator, and with the electroperator, my lyophilized just means freeze-dried DNA that I got from Shenzhen, China, and trout eggs and salmon eggs that I got from a local fish hatchery. I was able to electroporate. Electroporate just means electrocute. It's the scientific word for electrocuting DNA into a cell or into an
Bro, my
organism.
brain is getting electroperated right now. Like, it's like, keep going, keep going.
And
Oh,
so I
fuck.
essentially tased DNA into some fish eggs and I made some really jacked fish. And that's what got me started on this path because at 13 doing that, now more people were taking interest. So when I was about 15, I started doing herpes testing for a South African millionaire for the women that he was sleeping with.
Okay.
And
No way.
he was funding a lot of my projects.
Sick.
But he bought pretty much my entire home laboratory from my flow, like my laminar flow hood to my quantitative real-time PCR, my electrophoresis machine, my entire CO2 incubator, all of my tissue flasks, my reagents. He bought me a gene synthesizer. And essentially, he would just throw money at me as long as I was willing to do herpes testing for him.
So a billionaire paid you to do herpes testing on the women he was sleeping with, and in exchange, he basically funded your lab and got you started with your setup, with your biogen setup. It's like presumably costs like hundreds of thousands of dollars all in to start tinkering and fucking with. And what kind of stuff did you first do when you got the setup? Like, what was your first experiments that you did?
So the first things that I started doing was I did a little bit of cancer research, NF2 knockouts inside of Xenopus laevis, which would be your African clawed frog. And this particular gene, knockout means you delete a gene from the genome. So you're removing it from this like full amount of DNA. And when you
So
remove
that
this
way you
gene,
could remove, like, hold on, wait. In theory, the idea is if I can remove yeah, keep going, keep going, keep going. I think I understand what you're saying.
yeah, so by removing this gene, it created a line of frogs with cancer. So then these frogs could be used
Yep,
to test
yep,
cancer
yep.
drugs on them.
Right, right,
And
right,
so
right,
a lot of
right.
the early work I did was just recreating other people's papers where it's went on PubMed, found a paper that I thought was interesting, that was foundational for the things I was trying to do later on, and recreated it just to know that I could get the baseline principles down. Because there's not anyone teaching a 15-year-old how to do genetic modification on a
Yeah, no
tetrapod.
shit. Right,
So
right, right.
it was replicating these foundational papers to get to where I wanted to go. From there, I partnered with a few people over at UC Davis and at the University of North Carolina State. And the reason I partnered with these groups of people were they were the pioneers and still are to this day in transgenic birds. Transgenics is where you take a gene and you move it from one species to another. Trans, across, genetics, genes.
Genetic, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so I was looking, because remember, if we want to tie back to when you originally asked me Jurassic Park, I was looking
Right.
at, there's a man by the name of Jack Horner who did a lot of work in the 90s on trying to recreate a dinosaur from a chicken. He wrote a book, it's called How to Build a Dinosaur. And so a lot of his work that he did, I was very interested in. And so I was seeing if I could recreate it and then if I could expand
You wanted
upon
to
it.
make, be honest, you wanted to make a dinosaur.
I mean, who doesn't?
Yeah, okay, based. Look, can we? Okay, wait, no, you know what? Actually, this will be further along later in my questions. Okay, carry on.
And then so I started, which would be my sort of magnum opus, if you will, for a lot of my genetics
Hmm.
work. And that was my little dinosaur endeavor. And that was essentially accumulating all of these different papers over 3 decades and combining them together in ways, along with selective breeding, so more traditional forms of genetic engineering, with the more
Hmm.
new sci-fi sort of genetic engineering, that CRISPR, horizontal gene transfer, these sort of things.
Right.
And so some of the stuff I was doing was there's a
Is
mutation
that what
from
lateral? Is that what lateral genodata transfer means in the Nick Land thing that I was reading?
no, so lateral gene transfer is where without genetic engineering, without any of this fancy science in nature, you have something that's almost adjacent to CRISPR that happens randomly, where a gene from like say a
Ah,
fungus can transfer all the way into a bird or into a fish. And now
how?
this and so it's these things that can't naturally reproduce, but by methods that are not even fully understood by science presently, DNA from completely unrelated species can make its way from one to another. Psychedelic mushrooms would be a great example of this. There are 138 genera, which just means family groups of psychedelic mushrooms, that have
Yeah.
all convergently become psychedelic. But out of those, 46 of them all have the exact same genes with the exact same letters, even though they're completely unrelated to each other. They're from separate continents, separate parts of the world, but all of them have the same DNA when all of their closest cousins that aren't psychedelic don't. And so these
And
would be
we don't
examples.
understand the convergence yet. We don't know what the reason for that is.
Yeah, so I mean, we have understandings of some of it. So, like domestic cows are about, if you want to go to Google, this is a very fun thing to research. The domestic cow genome is about 23% pit viper. And the only
Ah,
reason for that is because there's horizontal gene transfer that's occurred over the time period of cow domestication inside of India. And the cows over in India are parasitized by the same species of tick that also parasitize the local
the
vipers.
snakes. Yeah,
And so,
God.
being that there's constant blood flow going from the snake into the cow genome based upon the ticks biting the snakes and then biting the
What, this
cows.
is fucking mental, dude. Okay, like my next question is going to be microchimerism. Then, like my next question is going to be like, how much logic is there into that? Like, look, just for anyone who, if I am dating a girl and 100 guys have nutted in that girl before, is it possible that there's gonna be some kind of geno transfer? Like,
Well, I mean, like, yeah, like horizontal recombination or horizontal gene transfer can occur that way, but more commonly inside of women. If a woman's ever had a kid, part of the stem cells from that fetus get transferred into her via the umbilical cord. And so in Minnesota, a few years ago, there was a woman who originally had a daughter. Her daughter had passed away. Decades later, she had remarried and had 3 new kids. But those children were not actually her children. They were biologically her grandchildren because the egg cells that made up her kids, in double quotes,
that's
came
fucking Back to the Future shit, man. That's insane. What the
came from
fuck?
the stem cells from her first child. As well as
Bruh.
there's also instances of genetic mosaics that are different sexes inside of people. Back in the 70s, there was an individual who self-fertilized because it was a male and female twin that had fused together in the womb, and they had
Mm.
phenotypically presented as a woman, but one of their ovaries was a testy, and they had managed to get themselves fertilized.
Wow. Wow. Hey, it just goes to show you, man, the shit that's out there. Yeah, someone in the chat, Lovecraftian. Truly fucking love. Like, wow, okay. That's fascinating, dude. Look, I'm going to have more questions about you and what you're up to at the moment, but just for the next few minutes, help me clear up some stuff, some really basic questions okay. Um, what are the biggest misconceptions that people have about genetic engineering? Like, are there any things we can't do? What are the hard limits of this stuff?
So with things like CRISPR, you need to know what gene you're looking for and you need to already have the sequence. So if you want to say add wings onto a fish, we can't do that because we don't know every gene that composes a wing and then we don't know how that would interact inside of the fish. If you want to take
Right.
like say the gene for glowing in the dark from jellyfish. It's one gene. It's very simple. It's called GFP. GFP stands for green fluorescent protein. We know the gene, we know the sequence, we know where it's at. So that's very easy to cut and paste out. But if you don't have the a priori knowledge, if you don't have that information to start with, the tool's useless because you still need to give the program.
Wait. How the fuck did we get the a priori knowledge that those particular like 4 or 5 sequences of genes actually made the thing glow in the dark amongst all the genetic code of the fish? Like, how the fuck is that? What people find out by sequencing the genome? They find out what every gene.
So when you sequence a genome, it gives you just a bunch of raw letters back, and then those letters. Are you familiar with what codons are? Or would you like me to explain it?
Yeah, well, but for the audience, and loosely I am, but yeah.
Okay, so in stretches of 3 letters, so remember those ATCG, you'll have codons. Codons will be like ATG, CTG, GGC, things like that. And these individual codons code for an amino acid. And so when the DNA reading software in the cell reads it, it'll say ATG, CCG, TGG, and it'll be like, okay, ATG is an A, like as in reference to an amino acid, and it builds proteins that way. And so what we can do is we can look at the protein, we can say, hey, this protein is glowing. We can see it as glowing because I'm putting a black light on it and it's fluorescent green. And then we can put that into a device called a mass spectrometer, and it'll tell us exactly what amino acids in what order make it up. And then we can then reverse transcribe what gene makes this up by just looking at the amino acids. We don't even need the animal itself. All we need is the protein. And then so we can go backwards from what we have and develop the gene from there. Or if we have an idea of what the gene looks like based upon reverse transcription, taking that protein and turning it into DNA, we can then cross compare what we've like reverse engineered with the organism we have at hand. And we can say, hey, this section of DNA that we've reverse engineered looks almost identical to this section of DNA. Let's remove the section of DNA from the jellyfish and test it out. Oh, wait, they both glow green. I guess we've now identified this gene.
Got it.
Then it'll get annotated.
Got it. Yeah. Fucking hell. Okay. Look, dude, how much of things like personality are heritable?
It honestly, so the field of epigenetics is starting to explore this, and epigenetics is a very, very new field. It's just slightly older than a decade. And I remember 10 years ago, there were papers coming out on like epigenetics for memory, which partially inspired the video games Assassin's Creed, if you're familiar with the whole Animus device and the idea of genetic memory. And so it's not stored as a gene. There's not a memory gene inside of your body, but there are epigenetic factors, which are essentially little extra DNA signals that are added onto your genome that only your body can read. And we don't fully understand them, but we know that they can code for memories or certain erotic things that you might be attracted to, or certain mannerisms. So inside of mice, there's a paper done in Japan about 14 years ago where they took male mice and they would give them the smell of cherry blossoms. And then after they were exposed to the smell of cherry blossoms, 30 seconds later, they would electrocute them. And they did this for months on end. And then they took those male mice and they mated them with females who'd never been electrocuted. They removed the male mice once the females were pregnant. Once those females gave birth, raised up their kids, and those kids, again, never had been electrocuted. When they were exposed to the smell of cherry blossoms, they would instinctually tense up.
As if it was poisonous, or as if it was electric. Yeah, fuck. Okay.
Yeah. Whereas a wild-type mouse would never do that. And so there's another paper.
What's the epigenetic distance on something like that? How many generations can you go before it like forgets about the smell of cherry blossom? Or have we not tested the limits of that yet? Like, is it in there forever? Once it's in there, it's in there. You know what I mean? Am I carrying around latent Neanderthal fucking that's what I'm basically.
Well, so it honestly depends if there's a selective pressure for it, or if it's an environmental thing, or if there's an advantage to it. We know without selection, epigenetic factors, depending on what they are and what they code for, can either be gone in your lifetime. So like astronauts that go on the International Space Station, there was a pair of twins. They sent one on the International Space Station for a year and they left the other on Earth. Identical twins. When the one brother came down from the International Space Station, over 1,000 of his genes had been epigenetically altered. So, but by the time after spending another year on Earth,
Okay,
most of them
okay.
had gone back to normal.
But
In
doesn't epigenetics fly in the face of like fucking about a hunt since doesn't epigenetics kind of prove Darwin wrong, like in a really core sense?
yay and nay, I mean, it allows for a level of plasticity that Darwin never accounted for, while at
Right.
the same time, it also further builds up a lot of these different evolutionary theorems. I mean, with Darwin's finches, Darwin just imagined that there were just naturally enough mutations in a given population, but that
Yeah.
wouldn't explain really small populations that can still rapidly evolve to a changing thing. Epigenetics does, because if all the birds are starving, therefore the babies that get less food grow larger mouths due to just change in gene expression without needing a mutation, those birds are going to be more adept at survival. Whereas under Darwin's original theory, there might only be one bird on the island, and if another female doesn't show up, the whole population goes extinct. But that wouldn't explain the myriad of life on our planet now, would it?
Fuck me. Okay. Okay. So in a very, very simple way, how far away are we from me getting like me being able to make myself 6'7" overnight? Like I get in the cryo tube, you fuck around, you do some tinkering on your machine or whatever, and then I bust out. I'm just like I'm 6'7", and I'm like, and I'm jacked. Like how far?
Mm.
Seriously, how far away are we from that?
Well, the height thing is an issue because your bone plates have probably already been fused together based upon your age. And I can't like
Right.
break your bones and cause them to regrow. So you're probably a little bit too old to get taller. As for getting jacked,
Damn.
now that's something that we can work with. There's a protein called follistatin that's a natural muscle growth agonist. Essentially, it inhibits a muscle growth antagonist known as myostatin, and you can get a gene therapy over the counter right now. You want to go online, you can buy it as a peptide form, and you can either
Uh,
get that or you can buy plasmids to genetically modify yourself online right now. And you can inject this into yourself. And what that'll do is it'll turn you into a somatic chimera. It won't modify your sex cells so your kids can't inherit it, but it will modify your body cells. Or there are other things like myostatin knockout, which you can also do as a gene therapy, which would again turn you into a somatic chimera. And that's the thing that regulates muscle growth. And so when you delete that gene, remember, knockout means delete a gene from your DNA.
yeah, yeah.
Your muscles don't have a regulation on them, so you don't need a workout to gain muscle mass. You just always have the most amount of muscle mass that you would have had if you would have worked out constantly. The one
Yeah,
deficit in
because
this
like
being,
I've noticed, for example, and again, I'm being very crude about this, but I've noticed, for example, that black guys do not need to work out so much in order to be jacked, but then they lose the jackness quicker than other ethnic groups. So I'm trying to work. Is that in a very, very simple way? Can you explain to me how that works and why that works? And I guess more interestingly is like the implication for stuff like aging. Like,
Mhm.
because is it safe to say certain groups age differently? And for example, will we be able to fix things like aging from a genetic standpoint, from a genetic editing standpoint?
So, in reference to African Americans in muscle group, there are a few prominent
Mm,
mutations inside of Central and Eastern Africa that allow for different muscle typing. So you have fast twitch muscle fibers, you've got slow twitch muscle fibers. Slow twitch muscle fibers are the ones for strength. Fast twitch muscle fibers are the one for speed. If you've ever
speed,
wondered why
right,
there are
right.
so many Jamaican or East African or Central African athletes that
Short distance
dominate,
sprinters. Yeah, yeah,
it would be different mutations that we don't see in places like Europe or Asia, but are actually quite common in certain regions of sub-Saharan Africa. And so when you're talking about muscle typing in reference to that, yeah, there are certain ethnic groups that are more genetically predisposed to either having more muscle mass or being faster, etc. And this has been known and proven genetically for decades. In reference to
yeah.
aging, there's a lot of transhumanists out there that are called grinders that are very much trying to halt aging. And so a lot of what they've looked into is things like telomerase, because there are, a, I wouldn't say a myriad, but there are definitely a bushel of biologically immortal species out there. Lobsters are biologically immortal. Lobsters can't die of old age. A lot of people don't know that. But the only reason lobsters die naturally is due to predation, something eats it, or because they get too big that it becomes, because lobsters constantly grow throughout their life. So if a lobster is,
Right.
say, 400 years old, it might be too metabolically taxing to try to move or to try to shed or to try to have sex. So they'll
Yeah,
die of
hunt for food.
exhaustion.
Yeah, so just die. Fuck, that makes so much sense. Because I heard that there were a lot of like species like that. There were a lot of species that at least had much longer lifespans than we realized, but they get predated on or they die of disease or whatever. That's fucking fascinating. So wait, the idea would be to take lobster telomerase and try and add them into the human gene. Like, how does that work?
No, the idea would be to modify the human genome to function like how a lobster's does, or the immortal jellyfish
Right,
is
right.
probably a really common example as well. The immortal jellyfish is a little bit weird though, because whereas the lobsters are just constantly producing telomerase, what the immortal jellyfish does when it gets stressed out, or when it gets too old, or when it gets to have reproductive issues, it'll just turn itself back into a baby and just restart its whole life process over again. Think about like reincarnation, but the death is unnecessary. You just one day you go into a cocoon and you crawl out a newborn. That's what immortal jellyfish do.
Fucking hell. Okay, okay. I mean, it's kind of, I mean, in a way, that's sort of what the life cycle of lots of asexual species do, right? But they literally die is the difference. I mean, then there's a new generation in the. Okay, okay.
Ha-
If all right. Random question, just so we and the audience can get to know you a little bit better. If you could genetically edit yourself in one way, what would it be?
there's a particular gene that was identified in giraffes that allows them to have a better cardiovascular system because being giraffes have such a long neck, they need to have extremely
You
high
need the
blood
blood
pressure.
flow. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it when it was put into mice and tested out in other animal models, they lived a lot longer than their wild type counterparts. And being the number one cause of death in America and a lot of the Western world is heart disease. I think having a modification like that to give me an edge up on the competition would probably be pretty cool.
A fucking good answer. You can tell that you've actually spent time thinking about thinking about that. All right, and lastly, of my basic bitch questions: designer babies, okay, elites who already call their kids ridiculous things like pineapple. Elites choosing to give their kids like purple eyes and hair colors that don't exist yet and shit like that. How far away are we from that, or is that sci-fi? You think?
Well, I mean, we've already had designer babies. Back in 2018, there were children born inside of China that are permanently immune to HIV.
Wow. Okay. So yeah,
And
in theory, it's doable now. It's just a matter of what's holding this stuff back then? Ethics and ethical considerations.
religious concerns and fear from the general public.
Bro, I'm not an overly religious person, right? I
Mm.
have more of a aesthetic moral compunction with this stuff than I do like a Christian Bible bashing thing. I get the Christians how they feel like you guys are playing God, but for me, it's more just like I just think that the things that man is going to make are going to be hideous abominations compared to the things that nature has crafted for it. So it's like, I mean, over time, right, and practice making perfect. I guess
Mm.
maybe I'm wrong. What do you think about that? In fact, talk to me about your religious stance. Where are you at on the God question and stuff like that? Being a 20-year-old scientist, I would assume you were atheist, right?
I'm not an atheist, I'm a Catholic.
Based. Okay. All right. So explain to me how you tie in. How the fuck do you square that circle, mate? Like between between.
I don't find it to be inconsistent with any Catholic doctrine based upon the fact that we use domestic foods and animal products in every facet of life. We've been genetically modifying animals for as long as there's been people.
That sounds base as fuck. I love your Russia. What's the church's official stance on this? Like, what does the church say about that?
What's Rome saying? Rome,
Yeah,
in
what's Rome
reference to
saying?
genetically modified food products, particularly animals and plants, Rome is mostly on board with. This has been a topic that's been commonly debated by theologians, especially in modern times, about genetic engineering of the synthetic or in a laboratory. Rome is mostly on board with a lot of different food products, particularly medicines as well. If it wasn't for transgenics or genetic engineered bacteria, most of the world's diabetics would have died as children. So obviously, Rome isn't against diabetics receiving medicine. In reference to
Yes.
designer
Okay.
babies, that would go against Rome's general doctrine under the same principles that things like IVF would go against Rome's general doctrine. There are already
Mm-hmm.
children in the world that could be adopted. Producing children artificially would not be an act of love, therefore would be heretical due to the Catholic Church, etc. As for things like transhumanism in reference to gene therapy, Rome hasn't given an official position on it because gene therapy can be defined a myriad of ways, from being taken as a medicine if you've got chronic wasting disease or if you've got a muscle disorder and you need to get a gene mod so that you don't end up looking like Luke Erickson.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very
Yeah,
gray
totally.
line there.
Yeah, because I can understand like why you'd want to engineer crops that can deal with different climates, or why you would want to look like even why you'd want to adapt people to fit better to living how we live in like the kind of cities and stuff like that. But I just think this open like one wrong mutation, man. I think we're opening a giant can of worms from an ethical standpoint that nobody is ready for. Like once it's out of the box, as Nick Aaron put it in that thing, once it's out of the box, like it's never going back in, right?
Well, let me ask you two questions. Did you ever actually read Jurassic Park by
Michael
Michael
Crichton,
Crichton?
yeah, fantastic. It's one of my favorite books of all time. Like it's incredibly well written book. Yeah.
Do you remember the twist of the original Jurassic Park series?
Not off the top of my head. I was probably like 14 when I last read it.
They're not actually dinosaurs.
Bruh.
The idea of Jurassic Park was that standing on the backs of giants in very much a Tower of Babel sort of way, we
Hmm.
tried in our own hubris to create dinosaurs, but they don't act like animals. In theory, a dinosaur should just act like any other animal. It should be looking for food. But in Jurassic Park, in this very Tower of Babel fashion, they're smarter than they should be. The raptors are calling people into the woods. They're drawing people in. They're setting traps. The T-Rex, which in theory should be a big bumbling predator, is stalking people and hiding just out of the line of sight of people, knowing that they're looking for it. The biggest twist in Jurassic Park is that for some unknown reason, we've created something that isn't all natural, but it's aware. And the second part would be, are you familiar with the concept of gene drives, which have already been used, but the concept of a
No,
gene
no,
drive is
no, no,
very
not
scary.
even heard the word gene drive, the term before.
So gene drive, are you familiar with Mendelian genetics, the thing you learned about in grade school?
Yeah, sure.
Gregor Mendel, the pea plants, where you have
Yeah, yeah.
a line of inheritance. With gene drives, you'll modify an organism and it'll have this gene drive, and 100% of its children, without fault, without a waiver, will always inherit its DNA. And so the purpose of these is to completely eradicate genes from a population, typically on an entire species. And so in places like Florida, genetically modified mosquitoes with gene drives were produced and released into the wild in the tens of thousands. And they were genetically
Wow.
modified males. And what they would do is when these males would mate with female wild type mosquitoes and they produce children, the female
They
children
have the gene drive. Yeah.
they have a mutation that makes all of the female mosquitoes sterile, essentially entirely eradicating a population, and only this one population. The part that I'm
It's
going,
about fucking time somebody did that to the mosquito population, to be honest with you. It's always like blown my mind that they've existed alongside us for so long and they contribute nothing seemingly to any ecosystem. Like they would be the first ones that I would fucking genetically engineer out of existence, to be honest. That's
but when you're
fucking
talking about
fascinating.
letting the cat out of the bag, the fear definitely does exist about what if someone were to create a gene drive and release it into the general human public, and
Yeah,
you could
no shit.
completely eradicate entire genes or give everyone a certain gene without anyone knowing. You could completely eradicate entire haplogroups from a population, completely covertly without anyone knowing.
Wow. The chances of something like that having already been deployed in the world, just for everyone's understanding, what would we're talking like very low, right? Presumably.
Gene drives rely on CRISPR. CRISPR wasn't discovered until 2013. If someone, the day CRISPR was discovered, immediately, and gene drives were discovered, well, built using CRISPR almost a decade later. If even
Hmm.
the day that CRISPR was discovered, they instituted that, those children with that gene drive wouldn't even be adults yet.
Okay, okay. It's just I was watching this thing literally earlier today about Robert Downey Jr. was filmed on a plane describing COVID as a bioweapon, and he said COVID and not Robert Downey Jr. Fucking RFK. RFK was filmed on a plane, saying, and he was saying that COVID was a bioweapon that attacked disproportionately attacked Black and ethnic minority people and disproportionately avoided Jewish people. I just thought it was a mental thing for him to be heard saying on a plane. But okay, in relation to bioweapons and stuff, would they work in this in a similar way when they're targeting, or is it possible that we could build weapons that would work in a similar way without going through the whole process of needing to fuck it into the population, if that makes sense?
Well, as for bioweapons, I mean, that's kind of a legally dubious topic to discuss on the internet. I will
Oh,
say
right,
that
right, right.
viral vectors, as in the things that you would use during gene therapy, those could be modified to not only be specific to particular ethnic groups or to be specific to particular cell types. And we take advantage of this in gene therapy that you can modify a particular virus as a vector to essentially bring the gene mod that you want to use to a specific cell type. So if you're trying to cure a type of cancer, you can modify the
Mm,
virus to only attack the cancer cells or to only move to your heart or to only move to your liver. There are
right, right.
antigens that exist in the population that are very specific. Say blood types, for instance. Blood types are antigens that are typically going to be associated with one population more than another, or
Mm-hmm.
other antigens throughout the body. You can have viruses that'll specifically target those antigens. And if this antigen is more prevalent in a certain ethnic or minority group or a certain population majority group, you could definitely, in theory, design a viral vector to target those groups.
Fascinating. And it's interesting what you say about like blood types and stuff. Okay, okay. Fascinating. Tangibly speaking, not based on what you've got in your house or in your lab or in your setup, but based in terms of what exists in the world today. What is the most crazy batshit X-Men type fucking human superhuman power? What's the are we at super soldier? Do we have the technology to make super soldiers? To make like bulletproof people with Kevlar skin and shit? Like how what is the actual limit of how far we can go? Currently as it stands, ethical
Well,
considerations out the window. Obviously, I'm assuming this is a black ops, black budget project. I'm giving you endless money. I'm giving you endless Asians to work for you. Like, what do you like? You know what I mean? Like, what in theory, how far can you go with this shit? Can we
well,
laser eyes? Like, you know?
some crazy things that are out there right now is a lot of people are working on anti-life. That's a pretty common thing that people are working on.
Anti-life.
Another thing that people did back in 2013 was they made goats that produce spider silk in their milk for developing bulletproof armor and bulletproof skin implants for soldiers.
Fuck off. Can you just say that again? Sorry, goat, spider, bulletproof. I'm fucking frazzled. Say it again. Like, what the
Okay,
fuck?
so they had genetically modified dairy goats to produce golden orb weaver silk proteins in their milk. So then these silk proteins could be extracted, spun into spider silk, either bulletproof vests or implants, so that they could either be worn as vests or implanted subdermally.
Implanted under the skin. Like, what the fuck? Madness. Absolute madness. So
Um,
it's growing one type of material, genetic, like synthetic, but not really because it's made of organic material. So it's growing organic material inside another type of organic life to be then implanted into a third type. I mean, that's fucking okay. Yeah, got it.
um,
Got it.
there's LRP5, which is a mutation that exists inside of a very small subsect of the human population that gives you unbreakable bones. And so that's been looked at for military applications by DARPA quite extensively for
I
either.
bet. That would be really good to drop a soldier out of a plane whose legs couldn't break. Yeah, like so.
Well, there's a few studies that were done with ballistic testing on their bones to see they can survive most like handgun caliber weapons at point blank range, all the way up to I believe just above 45 ACP.
Okay.
But so I mean stuff like that. There's a population of people inside of Papua New Guinea who have spleens that are about 45% larger and can hold their breath for 20 minutes underwater. So I mean that's a mutation that you could pop into people since it already exists in the population.
Yeah, yeah,
There's
yeah, yeah.
people with the quote unquote super sleeper mutation that only need about 2 to 3 hours of sleep to be fully rested. And these are just
I feel like everyone needs that, you know. Once the elites find out that everyone could be like that, human productivity could be 10x by reducing sleep. I think that's an obvious one. Like, holy shit. Okay,
and that's not even getting into trans genes where you're bringing in genetics from other species. These are just genes that are natively found inside of the human
in us
population.
already. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh,
But I mean,
and
if you
that is
wanted to
actually
bring in like
fascinating.
genes from other species, mantis shrimp have 30, not 37, they've got 13 different opsin proteins. They can see 10 more colors. And when I mean colors, I mean spectrums of colors than humans can even comprehend. I mean, I ask you right now, describe a
So
new color.
hold on, yeah, yeah, I can't do it. I thought about this extensively for totally different reasons. But hold on a second. So you're saying our visible color spectrum, like the rainbow, they see
Mhm.
10x, they see 10 more rainbows than we do.
Yeah, so like the human eye is based upon three color options. The human eye can see green, it can see blue,
Yep.
and it can
Yeah,
see
yeah, yeah,
red.
yep,
And
yep.
every other color you see is just overlaying between green and red, kind of like how a printer works, where you'll have cyan,
Yes.
magenta, and
Yeah.
yellow. And it's the overlays of these colors together give the illusion of other colors. These mantis shrimp can not only see those actual colors instead of just seeing the overlays, they can see into the ultraviolet range, they can see into the infrared range, they can see colors that our brain can't even comprehend. And so, if you want to talk about bringing in those genetics and popping it into a person, you could have people that could see colors, see messages, or see heat signs from other people. They could see your breath. So, I mean, stuff like that is all within the realm of possibility. Back in 2012, they added a new color gene into mice just to see if they could do it. And they produced genetically modified mice that could see new colors that no other mouse on the planet could ever even see. And their brain was able to
Crazy.
adjust to account for seeing that new color.
Okay, okay, okay. This is mad. If not if, let's be real about it. When genetic engineering becomes affordable and becomes made mainstream, will it not create an insane class divide? Like, we think it's bad between the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor now, and we can obviously see that this divide is growing. Poor people live in the world of money, rich people live in the world of assets. You know, eventually there's going to be some kind of money's going to go, there's going to be some kind of universal credit, whatever. But isn't it going to get to a point where, like, you know, your average normie guy on the street is not going to be able to have bulletproof skin and fucking like, so is this not going to be, will this not, do you think, further reinforce the kind of techno dystopia, or do you think there is a way that this can become like publicly? How do you see the future of the tech, quote unquote?
I don't think we'll ever get to like a full Gattaca situation if you're familiar with that movie from the
Yeah,
90s.
yeah, actually, it's one of the, yeah, yeah. Okay, okay, interesting. I was thinking about that earlier when I was asking you something, but that's kind of the thing I'm talking about. Yeah,
I
where
don't
it's
think
like
we'll
an
ever go
elite.
fully there. I think that what we're going to see is over the next coming decades, we're going to see gene therapies and things along those sorts. If you have a lot of these terminal diseases, you might see treatments for that start to get covered on insurances or start to become governmentally funded programs. And you might see a lot more stuff like that. As for designer babies, I think at least in
Mm.
my lifetime and probably all of ours here, it's going to remain more of the upper elite caste. I mean, it's not like we can make babies with IQs in the 180s right now. We could make babies that are like slightly more athletic, or if you wanted to have a different eye color, a different skin color, a different hair texture, things along those sorts, phenotypic traits, things like that we could do. But at that point, what real advantage is artificially giving your kid blue eyes as opposed to just naturally having blue eyes? What real advantage is
Dude,
going to be having
I'll be
early?
honest. The first thing I think of when I think like the applications of this stuff is just intelligence. If we know that intelligence is a certain percent hereditary, especially like generalized intelligence rather than specialized intelligence, right? If we know that we
Mhm.
can make people smarter and stronger, then I can literally see a world of 8 foot tall technocrat elites and like 6 foot tall peasant class. Like, I just think it's fucking very interesting that these things are even possible. And talking to you has made me realize it's possible in a way that I didn't really. And just again, it will probably sound paranoid to you, but you don't think this shit's happening in underground bunkers around the world in places because the technology is too new, too cutting edge. We are finding out about new stuff all the time, and therefore the chances of them having being 20 years ahead of us and keeping some underground army of super soldiers in like in Denver, Colorado, highly unlikely from where you're coming
I mean,
from.
from where I sit as a very active member of the biohacking community, For
Hmm.
about a decade, there have definitely been home labs in places along those lines, or people doing medical tourism in other nations where they're doing under the table genetic engineering. I have quite a few friends who have either gone to Europe or gone on a yacht out into the middle of the South Pacific Ocean to get particular gene mods.
International waters. Interna-
Well, no, so it's like things like earlier we were talking about myostatin or we were talking about foliestatin, those gene mods that
yes,
make you
yeah.
extremely muscular without needing to work out. 10 years ago, when that was still legally dubious, you had a lot of people that were overly cautious, so they would go out in international waters or to nations that don't have extradition treaties, and they would go get these gene therapies, particularly because it was more of not a vain thing, but more about just personal appearance or how you want to be perceived. And so
Right.
David Ishii, who's someone I mentioned earlier, he's on his YouTube channel that he has, he's injected himself with foliestatin so that he develops more muscle without working out. He made himself a
Fascinating.
somatic chimera. Josiah Zayner at DEF CON a few years ago, he genetically modified part of his arm to glow green.
I don't know how I feel about being what did you say it was called? Somatic chimera.
Yeah, somatic chimera, where your body cells have been modified, but not your sex cells.
Wow. Fuck. Okay.
So, George,
Yeah. Okay.
if it's okay with you, I do have this Telegram chat that I'm trying to promote.
Oh
Have
hell yeah, 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 absolutely. If you give it to Lewis, he'll post it in the link or whatever. And don't get me wrong, I'm going to ask you about your chat and your cult building shortly. But I just want to make sure. I just want to make sure two things. One, that the audience realizes how fucking smart you are and how much you actually really do know about this stuff. And this is not a LARP, right? Like I've interviewed a bunch of people before. Sometimes they end up being LARPers. Sometimes they end up being sick. But with this new series of interviews I'm doing, like Lewis and I are going out of our way to actually vet people and see. Like we've seen, for example, your house and your setup and your kit and stuff. And it actually blows my mind that you're so young. So I think it will blow a lot of other people's minds too. And some people will just refuse to to accept it. But that's part of the internet, man. I mean, like whatever. It's not without doxing and everything and revealing your name. Some people are just going to think you're a guy I hired from like to come on and talk about it. But like, there's nothing I can do about that. But
Yeah, I
just
mean, I could
so
definitely
people
post
can.
more of my setup, like in the
Oh
chat, like
hell
that
yeah,
Telegram
yeah,
chat, if
yeah,
people
yeah.
were interested.
Like post it, yeah, post it. Oh, there you go. I see Lewis is pinning that now. Yeah, Telegram guys, because obviously Telegram for this kind of stuff, I guess it's better for not getting banned. Um, okay, are there any like moral lines that you wouldn't cross personally? I mean, I know you said you were Catholic, but where do you draw where's the hard boundary for you? What wouldn't you do, for example?
So things that would kind of make me a pariah from Rome is in reference to genetic diseases. I would be okay with instituting policies that would remove genetic diseases from the general public via gene therapy in so like embryos that were already going to be produced through IVF or embryos that are going to be coming into the US via IVF. So essentially, there's a global embryo trade. A lot of people are familiar with this for IVF, where you can adopt an embryo from, say, Europe or Asia, if you're like a
Hmm.
person who struggles with fertility issues. So while you might live in Nebraska, you could get implanted with an embryo from Japan. But in reference to the global scale, and especially in reference to places like America, things like cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, um, chronic wasting disease, ASL, things like this. These are identified genes. We've known about the genes for years. I mean, things like sickle cell anemia or cystic fibrosis. It's one population, like one mutation that plagues the global population. One gene, not millions of genes, not thousands of different gene variants. It's not a commonly occurring mutation, but it's one mutation that happened 1,000 years ago, but it's been spreading throughout the population, and now you have people with this debilitating condition. And so I
Right.
think it would be a great idea if we could go and we could just say, hey, dude, what if we cured you? And what if this cure was going forward? No one would ever be born with this genetic condition again. Not saying sending anyone off to camps, not saying putting anyone in a chamber, just
No, no, no,
saying
no. It's I totally get where you're. I can totally see how you're coming from that for a point of like that creates less suffering and more good in the
a
world.
world where parents don't have to bury their children, where children can bury their parents, I think would be a better world to live in, and a world that I would like to bring my children into.
Yeah. Yeah, fascinating. And so I guess you don't have much time or much truck for the more Christian traditionalists. I guess they wouldn't even be more Catholic these days. They'd probably be more like evangelical type people, like Christian Science people who don't want any. I mean, those people are against medicating their children, let alone the stuff that you're talking about, right? But like, how do you feel towards those kind of people? You feel like they're just stuck in the past, or do you understand where they're coming from as a man of God yourself?
I think it's funny that I'm about to give you a Muslim proverb, but there's an old Muslim proverb that's something of the effect to trust in Allah, but always make sure to tie your camel. There's nothing wrong with
Right.
having faith in God, but as someone who wants to be a parent and who is engaged, I don't want my children to have to grow up with the possibility of struggling with a chronic illness. And I don't want to have to be the parent to bury my own child. And that's not to say I have any chronic illnesses. Luckily, I was blessed enough to be in peak health. But at the same time, the possibility always exists for a one-off random mutation to occur. And I also
Mm.
wouldn't wish that for any other parent, where the luck of the draw, you're going to have to bury your kid in 2 years after they're born, or luck of the draw, your kid has 15 minutes to live after 9 months of pregnancy. If we could avoid that in a positive manner, not in a way of violence and oppression, but just in a way of, hey, we have it's essentially a shot. And your kid won't die 15 minutes after being born. Your kid won't be born with its organs on the outside of their body. Your kid won't be born with a debilitating condition. I think that's
Mm.
something as a society that we should strive for, especially as people that want to build a better society. We should look at uplifting ourselves and improving ourselves instead of just leaving it all up to chance. And I think that a gracious God, a forgiving God, and a loving God would be okay with a father making sure that his child isn't buried, that he would want a father to make sure that his child has the best chance at life.
Yeah, look, in a lot of ways, it's like, in the Orthodox Jewish community, the rabbis have started to realize that there's too much inbreeding going on. And they've started to demand that I don't know what they call like congregants, do background, family history background checks before they marry each other, just in case they're not, first cousins or whatever. In a way, all you're doing, or all you seem to be doing, is adding guide rails to nature and to and kind of taking the sting out of. But ultimately, do you not worry that we will stop evolving entirely? Like that we will, once we take evolution into our own hands, it won't be evolution. Will we even be human anymore? Where's the limits of humanity for you?
Well, I mean, that's more of an epistemic question of what it means to be human. I mean, I can ask you
True,
the ship
true.
of Theseus real quick, and I could replace the ship of Theseus with a potato and a person. How many human genes do I need to put into a potato for it to be a human, and how many potato genes do I need to put into a human for it to be a potato? And what's your
Yeah, see,
threshold?
for me, humanity is not the genome. It's something else. It's something outside. I don't even know how I would quantify it or how it's in a way that like AI is sitting uneasy with me because it's becoming increasingly what I would call human. But yeah, I don't know what I don't know if I have a good definition of that myself. So I'm not
I would
expecting you to have
define
one at
human.
20 years old.
Well, no, I
But
have a definition of
how
human.
how how would you define human?
I would define humans as sophonts plus a societal consensus.
What's a
Sophonts is
sophont?
Sophont would be sapiens plus metacognition. Sapient, in a very loose and colloquial sense, would be what most people call consciousness. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
people would say humans are conscious, though animals are not. Consciousness doesn't
Mm-hmm.
really mean what a lot of people think it means. They use it more of a sci-fi sense. Sapience is that level of human cognition. Metacognition is the ability to have secondary thoughts. When I ask you a question, you can think about not only the answer to the question, but not only why did I ask you the question and why did you give me that answer? That would be metacognition. And the societal consensus component would come in from what we've agreed to be human. I mean, earlier you brought up Neanderthals when we were talking about epigenetics. If we
Mm-hmm.
agree that Neanderthals are a different species, and then we agree that humans are part Neanderthal. Does that make us not humans because we're not pure Homo sapiens sapiens?
That's such a sketchy definition, though, because I know I can make a robot with sentience in the next 500 years, and I know I can make it walk, talk, look, eat, shit, fuck like a human. At which point, human beings, being the soppy sacks of shit they are, will accept it as one of their own. And this, what did
Mhm.
you call it, social group? But then
Social
those robots
consensus.
will be. The social, then those robots will be human, but they won't really, will they? We know they're not human.
Well,
They're just some fucking
I mean, you kind of
artifice
just
things
gave
that we've
me the
made.
Bionic Man mixed with Blade Runner a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, a little bit.
But I mean, if you really want to go down that road of thinking, what's the difference between having a robot in human format that looks like if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and walks like a duck, and having a human consciousness that I put into a robot body, I feel like all of us could mostly agree that a human consciousness that was put into a robot body would still be a human in some capacity. But what is the actual symmetry breaker between that human consciousness put into a robot body as opposed to a robot that can do everything that the human consciousness can? They're identical.
Right. Yeah, fascinating shit to think about. And do you think, I mean, you've kind of described it as a good thing, but in a weird way, I guess you kind of believe we have like a moral obligation to fix the human genome and to improve ourselves, right?
Yeah, I believe that something that is a core tenet from my teachings that in my little cult that you've previously mentioned is the
Mm,
right to transcend one's condition, which I believe should be an inalienable human right.
the right to transcend one's condition. So, are you a transhumanist?
To an
Would you consider
extent,
yourself
yes.
to be a transhuman? Okay, so you want to go past. So actually, you do know what human is. You want to go past it. You want to go beyond it. You want to be more than human.
Well, I would say just redefining what it means to be human.
Hmm. Yeah,
I
because it
would,
will change, won't it? If the majority of us all consider ourselves to be humans and the parameters change, then yeah, the goalpost will change. It won't be. We won't come up with a new name for ourselves. We will consider ourselves human,
yeah, I mean,
regardless.
if you stuck 50,000 people on Mars and then you waited 7,000 years, I guarantee they're still going to consider themselves human, just of a Martian variety. Even if they might phenotypically look different than you or I, they might have orange skin, they might be 7'8", they might just be phenotypically different in every way than you would consider every other human, but they still might categorically consider themselves human. And if they're integrated into our society, we would probably still categorically consider them human. And so it's just redefining this in a method that's congruent with how we perceive humans inside of our society or as society evolves.
So, some objections from the chat. Just reading back through the chat over the past hour or so that we've been talking. Some people saying animal cruelty here. How do you feel about that?
Animal cruelty in reference to what?
I guess some of the experiments you were outlining and mentioning. I mean, look, come on, dude. You're gonna have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, right? You're
Yeah.
gonna tell like, how did we get here at all in the first place? We've done a hell of a lot of like testing on things that have not wanted to be tested, right? And no
Well,
compunctions about that.
yeah, I mean, in reference to like transgenics, so when I was making genetically modified birds, which I still do to a lesser extent, but I'm mostly working on mammalian
They
stuff
say
now.
it so fucking casually. Bro, do you understand how much of a nerd you are? Like, holy fuck. You have a cult of people following you on the internet because you're charismatic and because you're interesting. You're not exclusively a nerd. You don't fit the nerd archetype too well. But holy shit, did you say that sentence again? When I
When I
was genetic.
when I was making genetically modified birds in the past. But I mean, so what you do there is you'll go into one embryo and you'll essentially siphon some blood cells from it. And in those blood cells, they're going to be what's called primordial germ cells. They're the stem cells that will eventually compose sex cells. They'll make up your reproductive system. And so you'll siphon those. You don't unalive the initial embryo. The initial embryo is fine. You're
Okay.
just removing some of its cells. You'll take those cells, you put them in a petri dish, and then you'll modify them, and you can modify them a myriad of different ways. You can do random gene integration, which is where essentially you'll take linearized DNA it's naked on both ends of the strand. There's no special method for inserting it. You're just essentially taking the DNA and you're exposing it to the cell and you're praying to whatever deity or deities you believe in that the DNA integrates. There's targeted gene integration like CRISPR or like TALENs, where now it's going into a very specific spot. It's orchestrated by your own hand. You know where it's going. Once you have these cells that have been modified, you then take those cells, you go over to another embryo, and you just inject those cells in. Those birds grow up to adulthood. You'll take the male birds and you'll what's called PCR, also known as polymerase chain reaction. It's a machine that tells you if there's a particular DNA sequence in like in a sample, and you
Mm-hmm.
need primers, and the primer is essentially what it's looking for. It's a 20 segment piece of DNA that it's looking for. And then you'll pop in your sample, the PCR will analyze it, and it'll say either the sequence is present or it's not present. If it's not present, you test the next bird. And the reason you go with male birds is because you can't test egg cells unless you're dissecting a bird. And if you're dissecting a bird, then obviously you can't breed it. But you can test sperm. And so when you're testing sperm, if all you have to do is extract semen from this male, oh, he doesn't have it, move on to the next male, you can go through 100 males long before and get them confirmed
long before you could ever get a female confirmed. And then once you have
Right.
this one male, now he's called your founder, and you'll produce an entirely new bloodline of genetically modified birds from this one individual, and they'll all have this trait. So no animals being harmed, nothing's being modified while it's an adult, nothing's being injected, nothing's feeling pain. We're talking about
It's actually a
modifying.
fantastic example of how you can do like, yeah, how you can move work forward and not actually. Yeah, it's a really, really good point. Okay. Interesting. Yeah.
And I mean, mouse
And
models are the
yeah.
exact same way.
But surely some of the work involves killing mice. Like this, like I mean, it depends what you're doing, right?
Well, no, I mean, like, so with it's called induced pluripotent stem cells. You can take, and this works for people too. I can take a little bit of your skin, I can put it in a
Hmm.
petri dish or a T25 flask or a T51 flask, and I can give it the right hormonal, protein, and pH signals, and I can convince that little bit of skin that I took from you and convince it to either grow into a whole new human person. I can convince it to grow into whatever cell type I want, neurons. I can convince it to grow into a brain. I convince it to grow into eyes. I can convince it to grow hair or teeth. And so
Man.
commonly what's done is you'll take a little bit of skin from a live mouse, you'll anesthetize it so it goes under anesthesia. You'll remove a little bit of tissue from using a biopsy. You'll pop that tissue into a disc. You'll reprogram those cells to think that they're part of an embryo, and then you'll modify those induced pluripotent stem cells, and then you'll inject those cells into an actual embryo. Embryo develops like normal inside of a mouse. When that baby's
Hmm.
born, it's a chimera, and then when it goes and it reproduces, we pray that some of its children are modified. If those children are, those children are used as a founder, and boom, we've now established how to make animal models, and not only birds, but also mammalian models.
Crazy, crazy. But all I can do is think about how this applies to humans. Human, like changing
Well,
humanity in the future. Crazy.
brain organoids or something. They were originally talked about. DARPA looked into it with like growing human brains to either control
Dude, I've
nuclear
seen some
power plants.
crazy fucking videos of these on TikTok of people pretending that they're real. Like, okay, talk us through. Is that how much of that is? I guess you haven't seen the videos I've seen.
Is
Explain
it from
firstly to the audience
Bearbait?
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
dude. Yeah,
I'm
explain.
mutuals with her.
No, so hold on. That's all real.
Yeah, no, that's 100% real. It's what we
Okay,
just
explain
talked
to the
about.
audience. Explain to the audience what the
A
actual
brain
organoid
organoid.
computer
Yeah.
does. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so to go from baseline to like complete computing, and I have a friend who actually has a video. He has a video series on his YouTube channel about growing a monkey brain and growing a rat brain and teaching it to play Doom on a computer. But so what you'll do is, like we talked about, you'll remove a set of tissue. It can be skin, it
Yeah.
could be a hair follicle, it could be literally just a little bit of your cheek cells. You'll take those cells, you'll reprogram them. You'll turn them
Hmm.
into stem cells, and then you'll gaslight the cells into thinking that they're a brain. And then they'll grow their own brain. And what we've noticed with a lot of the human organoid brains is they don't just grow a brain, they'll also grow eyes so they can see the world around them. And so then you'll take this brain organoid and you'll pop it onto a very selectively made silicon chip. And then the brain, the neurons themselves will interface with the chip. And then based upon positive reinforcement, much like what Pavlov did with his dogs, you'll
Hmm.
essentially teach the brain how to talk to the computer. And then the brain can then function like a CPU for the computer. But since brains can learn and computers need programming, this CPU, an organic CPU, it's called Wetware, is the clinical term or the empirical term for it.
That's so fucking dystopian. It's like so fucking, bro. Can you imagine being born as an organoid? Fucking, can you imagine like the first time this thing gets access to a Word document and it's like a 4-year-old like pissing itself and realizing it's conscious for the first? It's like, help me, I'm a monster. Kill me. Like, bro, it's gonna be fucking insane. Like, apparently these computers, if you get a bunch of organoid brains and I'm being very reductive obviously, but apparently if you get a bunch of organoid brains and you hook them up to a computer, you get something that like 10x's AI, because it's just a bunch of
Well, yeah, so human brain organoids, especially if you watch Bearbait, like G's content, they outperform every AI model that we have currently because it's essentially a human brain controlling a computer. Like they outperform AI in reference to gameplay, they outperform AI in reference to problem solving, because all it is a human brain. It's just a human brain doing these tasks. So, I mean,
Yeah.
and it can learn, it can conscientiously make decisions. It can take what it learned and didn't work, and it can apply that and learn from its mistakes to then better apply them. And so, like, wetware is definitely being looked at, especially for military applications. Back in
I bet.
if you
Yeah,
if you
yeah,
go
yeah.
on Google or if you go on YouTube, there's videos from all the way back in 2011 from DARPA where they were taking brain organoids and using them to pilot drones and simulations. And the brain organoids who were only ever given the context, only ever given the subjective experience of just being a drone and their positive reinforcement coming from like bombing enemies, that they outperform human pilots because they're only getting dopamine whenever they bomb a target. And so if whenever they want to get that happy feeling, whenever they want to feel satisfied, the only way they can get that is by accurately bombing a target. So they outperform humans because humans, we have all of these moral qualms. We have all of these issues. We have hesitations. We have delays. We have things that can distract us. The brain in a dish doesn't. And so the brain in a dish will outperform human pilots and AI pilots. And so that's why it's looked at.
You cannot beat the brain in a dish. A game of Go or a game of chess. Like, imagine, dude, there's something so fucking dark about taking something that is living, right? In the way that people have empathy for animals or children, where like you take this living pile of cells and then just positively reinforce it by giving it dopamine when it performs desired action. By the way, desired action is like manning a fucking unopt drone over Palestine. It's just like absolutely fucking insane, dude. Mental timeline that we're living
But
in.
right
Absolutely
now,
fucking mental.
as like a third party consumer, no matter where you're at in the world, there's a few Danish companies that exist where if you want to like do computing on a human brain, there's a few
Mhm.
companies out there where you can essentially rent a human brain chip and do all of your processing on it. They do a subscription service. It's like $49 a month, and you can rent your own human brain chip and just to have programming done on it. Or if you wanted to like use it to like arbitrate like a function in like your server, you just rent the human brain chip. And essentially the human brains, based upon now, they only have like 168 to like a year-long lifespan just because they start
Okay.
getting too big and too complex because again it's essentially it thinks it's the developing baby, and so they start getting too complex.
Dude, here's a crazy notion for you. It is a fucking developing baby. How about that? How about that, Mr. Catholic? How about that? Holy shit. Like, it thinks it's getting off. Look at it. Fucking stupid brain in a dish. Thinks it's a fucking baby. It's like, nigga, that is a baby. You fucking crazy. Like, if left alone in a womb, like, you know what I mean? Like, oh,
Well,
God.
no, it would never develop into a baby in its own right. This is
I
just
guess
neural
not. Yeah,
tissue.
right.
It would be no
You
different than if I like. It would be no
you know
different
those
than if I went
tumors
into a
that people have
rat.
sometimes. You know,
Yeah,
people grow
teratoma.
tumors and the tumors. Yeah, and they have like a tooth in there and a fucking eyeball
Yeah,
in
it's
there,
a
and they're trying to work out
teratoma.
if. Okay, so it's a teratoma in a petri dish.
Essentially,
Oh, that's
it's
like,
no different than if I were to go into my hand and remove some of my nerve cells and pop it into a dish.
I guess not. No, I guess not. Man, all those ancient religions saying that people don't get souls until they're like 4 years old, it's starting to make a lot of fucking sense now. I'm not gonna lie. Wow, fuck me, crazy. Okay.
But I mean, we could, if you want to talk about de-extinction for a second, we could go there to
Yeah,
circle back to Jurassic.
That's the logical next step. Yeah. De-extinction. What the fuck? Oh boy. Okay. Good. Please.
So there's a few companies out there that I'm friends with the owners of. So like Ben Novak with Revive and Restore, they're working on bringing back things like the thylacine, the dodo bird, the
Mhm.
passenger pigeon. Another
See, that
one
is
who's,
based. I do want to see a dodo bird before I die. I'm not gonna lie. That's fucking cool.
you know, the dodo bird's a type of pigeon.
I didn't, but it doesn't surprise me too much. I guess the big chest, the kind of the way it. Yeah. Okay.
And
Interesting.
being
When
being
you
it's a
say type of
pigeon,
fish, you mean the same genus, the same family as like
yeah, no, it's part of
Colum.
Columbomorpha.
Right. Wow. Okay.
And so that wasn't even the largest pigeon. That would be its cousin, which would be what is it? It's like Ralpheus. It's from the sister island over because it's this 3 island chain off the coast of the eastern side of the Horn of Africa. You've got Reunion Island, and then you've got the other two.
How big
And
were dodos?
dodo birds were about the size of a turkey, and then they're the sister
Okay.
species that was on that other island was larger.
So like basically a giant fucking pigeon. But that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, but just like all
I
pigeons, they make milk. So I mean,
sorry, mate. Sorry. What am I? Have I? Do I? Sorry. Sorry. What?
well, yeah, all pigeons make milk.
What? Have I slipped into a different timeline? Isn't milk a mammalian thing? What do
Well, no, I
you
mean like
mean?
certain cockroaches make milk. There's actually a German chocolate company that exclusively makes milk chocolate with cockroach milk.
Of course
Um,
there is. Yeah.
there's a spider species that makes milk, but yeah, all pigeons and flamingos, they make milk. It's called crop milk. They make it in their throat. And yeah, flamingo milk is blood red though because it's heavily saturated with the carotenoids of the shrimp and algae that they eat. So it's this very much
Oh.
vermilion or maroon colored milk. But yeah, no, dodo birds made milk, and that's kind of one of the biggest issues with bringing back a dodo bird is just the amount of milk that it would require to feed a squab. Also, who's going to lay the egg? Because you can't take a dodo bird, which had an egg the size of a goose's, and you can't stuff that baby into a pigeon who has the egg the size of a quail. Now, can you?
I don't know, dude. You tell me. This is crazy. Does your angel investor have, or the people that you know? I'm assuming you're moving in quite like some very interesting circles. Put it that way. Have you been approached by anybody else? Like Peter Thiel come up to you and been like, "Yo, I'd like to do real Jurassic Park." Or something like, what's the weirdest kind of shit? What's the weirdest shit
Well,
you know about that's happening in this space?
um, I mean, like I've been approached by like a few of the de-extinction companies. They've definitely slid me some money before from my de-extinction project that I'm running.
Wow. Okay. Wow.
But so like I do like a lot of hybrid bovid work with like I'm working with hybrid bison, hybrid yak, and essentially combining longhorn genetics, African Watusi cattle genetics, wild yak genetics from the Tibetan mountains, and then American bison genetics, and trying to produce an animal that looks like an extinct species of bison known as bison lactifrons, which had them about 8 foot 6 inch horns tip to tip and stood about 6 foot 7 at the shoulder.
6'7" with a wingspan, horn span of like 4 each side. That's insane. And what? Wait. What you? So you're working on this currently?
Yeah. I mean, I post
And
pictures
where?
of like my animals all the time.
Amazing. And where are these things going to be when they're finally brought back into or brought into? You know.
So for like at least my project, the appeal of it was for hunting ranches as sort of a novelty. Whereas it's
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
that
Okay.
hasn't walked the planet in about 10,000 years because a lot of the North American megafauna was wiped out due to Native Americans and overhunting. Things like mastodons inside of North America, that was the American mammoth. Things like giant ground sloths, they were already kind of in a rut due to the Younger Dryas period. And then when Native Americans cross the Bering Strait, they come over here, they see giant food items, and they start hunting them to extinction. And so, since Native Americans showed up, bison went from being, like I said, 6 foot 7 at the shoulder to now the modern bison is slightly larger than a cow.
Mm,
And so, it's
that's
just that
mad.
overhunting driving the population down, getting to hunt something that no other human has hunted or tasted in over 10,000 years, I thought would have a
Just
lot
thinking,
of.
what? Can you imagine like bison jerky from like a megalithic fucking bite? That's absolutely fucking insane.
Well, a lot of
Crazy.
bioart in the biohacking community is pretty common. There was a Swedish bioart agency, I believe 2 or 3 years ago, that did a
Sorry,
mammoth.
bio art. I don't. What do you mean by art? Bio art.
So in the field of genetic engineering, there's a lot of people that look at genetic engineering as a medium of expression for artwork. And
Okay.
so there was a guy back in 2018 who was genetically modifying and selectively breeding fruit flies to live on Saturn's moon Titan. There was, and where I was going to tell you is there was a bioart agency that produced a mammoth meatball, and they were selling samples of the mammoth meatball so you could taste what a woolly mammoth tasted like.
Fuck, that's crazy.
And
That's
essentially, what
fucking
they did
crazy.
was they genetically modified sheep and they took all of the muscle flavoring components, the thing that actually gives meat its flavor, because the whole mammoth
Yeah.
genome has been sequenced for years. They took all of those genes that give like the meat its meatiness and they popped it into a sheep and then they butchered it and they made a meatball. And so the meatball has all of the flavoring components coming from a mammoth. So when you ate the meatball, you got to taste something that no human has tasted since just about the same time period when the pyramids were being built. A lot of people think woolly mammoths died out a really long time ago. Woolly mammoths survived after the pyramids of Giza were already built.
That's fucking mental. I didn't know that. I didn't know that at all.
Yeah, there was a
It's like
population that made it up until I believe about 1,200 years ago, maybe 1,000 years ago, inside of
so we
Siberia.
probably have a very strong like genetic affinity for that taste, right? Given that we like ate it for so long or lived off of it.
Possibly.
And
I mean, in reference to woolly mammoths, because they've gone extinct so recently, we definitely pull a lot of material out of like the permafrost. And all the way back in 2018, there was another paper where they took some of this preserved tissue from a woolly mammoth that they pulled out of the permafrost. They thawed it out. They took the nucleus from the cell and they just popped it into a mouse egg cell to see what it would do. And when they stimulated it with electricity, it started dividing into an embryo.
and that presumably they didn't let it come to term.
Well, obviously it died because the mitochondrial issues of putting a mammoth nucleus into a mouse cell. But
Well,
it's
that's
just,
the thing. I don't know if nature would just find a way, quote unquote, and it would figure itself out. But is it going to be possible for us in the future to make entirely new forms of life?
well, yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I was touching on earlier with the whole anti-life or xenonucleic acids thing. Xenonucleic acids are like alien base pairs that don't exist in Earth life.
But
And
not on the
anti-life,
micro, on the animal level. Like, will we be able, for example, like there'll be a very clear point in the historical record, in the genealogical record, where birds and lizards diverged from each other or whatever. And then would we be able to go back and create a third prong, a third branch of that tree, and take it in a new direction? And then what, like, is that possible?
yeah, I mean,
Or would
so
we don't have the time, I guess, to evolve it out and see how it would evolve. That's basically what I'm thinking. There's something we could do with computers to simulate that and then bring those things into reality. Pokemon, basically, bro. We make Pokemon.
about 2 weeks ago was the first ever entirely synthetic eukaryote was produced in a lab. The world's first ever was 2 weeks ago. And it was
Wow.
an entirely synthetic yeast strain where it was completely designed and built by a computer. And it went from being a computer program, and now it's on the world, it's in real life, and it's dividing, it's reproducing, and it's blue. And so, like, yeah, if we can do that in
It's
fungi,
blue.
if we can do that in
Dope.
fungi, we can do that in animals. It's just going from like complexity. Because the higher you go up the tree of life, the more and more complex things get. So, like when you
Right.
start off with like fungi or bacteria, it's very hard to mess up these systems because they're so simple. Bacteria are the simplest system, archaea are a step above that, fungi are a step above that, plants are a step above that.
Okay.
And once you get into animals, the very lower echelon animals still function essentially like a plant or like a protist or like a fungus. A
Right.
lot of
Right.
sponges and stuff, they're very hard to mess up because it essentially functions like a living tumor. You can't make cancer more cancerous. But when you get into
Yeah. Okay.
something,
It is what it is. It's reached the max. The complexity is so limited that that's the. Yeah, I get it. Okay. Okay.
yeah, but when you get into things like fish or birds or lizards, now we have to worry about Hox genes. Hox is short for homeobox. It's the instructions genetically that tell your body where to put things. And when you start
Okay.
messing up those things, there are so many factors in the genome where it's like this gene, sure, we know what it does. It says have legs, but it needs to be sandwiched in between these two genes because if it's not,
Otherwise, you get a leg on your forehead. Yeah, got it right.
well,
That's
so
fucking
not
insane.
that. There's a paper that came out in 2021 where if this gene was removed from the spot it should be, and it was under the same promoter, so that's the same light switch that turns the gene on, but you put it in a slightly different part of the genome, you still have four legs in the normal places, but instead of forming male genitalia, you form an extra pelvis with another pair of legs. So like that's what I'm talking about.
What? Wow, fuck me. That makes no sense why that would happen. What, like,
Well, a lot of the like promoters and genes that are because genes don't just do one thing. A lot of genes will do dozens of things, if not hundreds of things. BMP4 like controls the vast majority of like how your face is structured and like your facial phenotypes. But at the same time, it's
okay,
also the reason that you have like a wiener. I don't know if I could say dick on YouTube. So
you
like
can.
it,
Yeah,
yeah, so
interesting.
used to being on TikTok debates and don't want to lose the
Yeah,
account with
yeah, yeah.
22,000 followers.
No, no,
But
it's good. But you got okay, fascinating. Like, fuck.
so like stuff like that. So when we go up into complexity, it's having to look out and make sure there are not these off-target effects. But if you're saying like in reference to as computing gets better, as AI gets better, if we could develop a software that could essentially go through everything that's known and be a predictive model and then reorganize stuff like we did in the East, then yeah, no, I could 100% see like designer fish that don't exist in nature, where essentially they take a goldfish, they pop its genome into a computer, and then you're like, I want it to have 6 fins, I want it to be purple, I want it to have 4 eyes, and I want it to have face tentacles. I mean, all of those things we could do now in a goldfish, a single gene at a time. If you want to make a purple goldfish, you would just pop in a chromoprotein for a deep sea anemone. You'd make a purple goldfish. If you want to give it extra face barbels, there's a gene, it's called CNNABCA1. And if you overexpress that, you can get more face barbels. Those are little tentacles on carp and such. If you wanted to give it 4 eyes, that would be PAC6. You would just ectopic means you turn it on in the wrong spot. So the gene's being expressed somewhere that normally wouldn't be. You get a fish with 4 eyes. 6 fins, also just another Hox gene. So we could do these things individually and make these designer animals, but it takes time. If we get to a point where we can just have a computer essentially do all of that for us, we're going to get to a point where the pet industry or where the food industry or where the just I guess just general like the private sector in reference to anything that's ornamental could be completely uprooted. And I think it might honestly be a double-edged sword for environmentalism. Would you like me to explain that?
Sure. Yeah.
It takes pressure off of pulling wild species from like, the surrounding forest. So like aquaculture, particularly for like the domestic fish like hobbies for like aquariums and such. There are certain species that you can only get and we can't breed them in captivity. So we need to go to the Amazon rainforest. We need to go pay some Colombian guy for him and his 13 children to go out into the Amazon rainforest with a fishing net for a month and come back with this rare species of barb that there's only like 100 of in the wild. And once they're in captivity, they're in captivity. And then once they're dead, they're dead. This is things like the white cloudy minnow, which only exist in captivity now due to like aqua trade, aquaculture, etc. And so if we can take something like a goldfish and transmutate it into something that is so different and like use it as like a blank slate and create these new designer animals specifically to give it to the pet trade, it could take a lot of pressure off species in the wild so they can recover and they can rebound from constantly being poached or constantly being removed.
Right. Yeah.
At the same time, producing these designer species, what happens if they get out into the wild? And what happens if some of those synthetic mutations permeate through a wild population? What if those purple four-eyed goldfish get out into Gary Britain, which already has an established feral goldfish and feral mirror carp population? And what if those 4-eyed goldfish start breeding with all the mirror carp in the UK, and now all of the mirror carp in the UK have 4 eyes? So that's the double-edged sword aspect of it.
It's absolutely fucking fascinating. Listen, I could sit here all night asking you questions, but I want to ask you more about you specifically. Just before we move on to that, though, Kimo Sabe in the chat says, George, can you ask him if taking multivitamins with my coffee every morning counts as biohacking? So, Azrael, where can we go? Don't worry, you don't actually have to answer that. Where, what you want to? No, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that would fall under nootropics, which I guess like is a very, very out of bounds for biohacking, but it's para adjacent.
So you mentioned that you have like a TikTok following. I know you're trying to do some like different stuff on the internet now, using like not using your face and your name, etc. But on TikTok, you have a bunch of followers. Lewis, I will pin the comment of where people can find your telly chat. Thank you, mate, for posting that in the chat, Lewis. Talk to me a little bit about your cult and the weird group of people who have assembled themselves around you on the internet. I find that fascinating. Because look, man, I'm just going to be honest with you. If I was you and I had your age and if I had your skill set, I would be already looking about where I could buy my private island, to have my genetically engineered like concubines and these fucking crazy animals that don't exist yet flying around and stuff. Like so I can totally understand why you might have attracted a small cult following of eccentric people, but what's going on with that?
Well, sadly, I don't have a harem of cat girls and fire-breathing dragons, but yeah, jokes aside, No, I started off debating on TikTok, mostly in the political forum section, doing things like abortion, immigration, Israel, Palestine, those sorts of things. And I have my own set of political ideas that I would love to see implemented. And I've been trying to gather individuals of a like-minded happenstance and kind of
Mm.
assemble them together to form not a regime per se, but definitely a collective of individuals that are just like-minded or share similar things
Individuals
or would
who
like to,
makes sense. Okay.
yeah,
And
just kind of perpetuate.
what kind of people are you looking for to join your organization?
Well, I guess my biggest problem right now is I have way too many women as part of my following and not enough men. And
Terrible
my
problem to
follow
have.
No, it is because I mean, if I want to go to like host protests, if I want to go to rallies, if I want to have things like that, I need a lot more men because I can't have a bunch of girls between the ages of 18 and 24 holding up signs and being the one
Yeah,
guy there.
I
I
feel
need a
you.
lot more men. And so that's the biggest issue that I'm running into.
So when you say you're trying to build like a political movement, then go to rallies, outline for us your because we've touched on obviously what you do and your faith and that kind of stuff. But like, talk to me about your political beliefs. How does this stuff infect or affect your politics and how you view things politically?
Well, as personally, if we're going to touch on myself for a second, I'm an individual
Yeah.
of mixed descent, right? I've got a
Go
little bit
on.
of, I've got some Mediterranean in me. On my mother's side would be of Spanish descent and of French and of Belgian descent. And then on my father's side is very much Irish and very much African, particularly from Nigeria. And
Nice.
so the way I've viewed the world has always been about kind of like min-maxing in reference to a video game, taking what works instead of like dying on the sword of an ideology. I've never really understood that. And so what I would like to do is I would like to collect a bunch of ideologies, whether borrowing them or retrofitting them from other frameworks that do work and have been proven to work and have worked since time immemorial, and kind of assort them together.
You're trying to do gene editing of politics. That's what you're trying to do. That's so interesting.
Well, yeah,
Fuck, man.
it's I kind of take that same approach with everything that I'm interested in. And it's kind of
Mm.
assembling that framework of what works, what doesn't work, what can we do to benefit people as a whole. And so I guess the political thing that I'm trying to start is definitely a collective of like-minded individuals that would like to benefit and have these shared like-minded ideas of things like nationalism per se, or would like more of a mixed economy. I know there's a lot of NatSocs out there, NASBulls out there, but I do like the idea of a mixed economy because to present time, from bartering systems to 2025, mixed
Mm.
economies, ones that do have social programs but also do have very capitalistic tendencies, they do tend to perform the best in the long term, and they do test to give the most amount of dollar power to the people of that nation. Things like that, or in reference to genetic engineering, like we talked about earlier, the inalienable right to transcend one's condition. In certain nations right now, due to religious dogmas or due to cultural statutes, it is illegal to seek treatment for having a debilitating condition. If I
Mm.
was a cripple in a chair and a man on the other side of the planet could get me out of that chair, but my government said, no, you can't, because some pedophile who licked a rock said that we couldn't do it. Personally, I would be upset. I mean, it's just the coalescing of all of these different ideas together and also rejecting a lot of things that I see commonly perpetuated inside of culture now. I think one of the biggest issues for the West in its whole is culture. And I think what it's becoming and what it's evolving into.
Fucking fascinating, dude. Absolutely fascinating. Okay. And if you do you have like I know you've got a pretty active Discord. There's people in the chat asking me, George post his socials. I can't. That's what I'm saying. He has a public persona and he has a private persona. And we've been lucky enough to get access to his private persona so he can actually speak his mind and we don't have to get the politically correct bullshit approved narrative version of events. And if you want to speak to him, you have to go into his Telegram chat. This is what I'm trying to tell you.
Mm,
Motherfuckers. Ugh. Anyway, you get what I'm
yeah.
saying. No, okay, cool. And then that's where people can find you. You're gonna set up a YouTube shortly, am I right about thinking that?
Yeah, I wanted to do interviews with other political creators that are more like on this sort of the internet, just trying to see where they're at.
Yeah.
And I mean, my background of like debating on TikTok, I've been doing it for better half of a decade. And so just like doing that, I've done like public forum, I've done debating for competition, both from an academic level, from a non-academic level, from a collegiate level, or just bullshitting around on TikTok doing abortion debates or race debates, etc. I would definitely like to see a lot more of that content happen on YouTube instead of just like only on TikTok or places like Twitch.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think honestly, dude, I think you have I think you're very, very interesting, like I said to you before, smart enough and relatable enough that you could get an audience on YouTube kind of easily. And fuck me, man, if you've got time, that is, between doing all of this other stuff. But yeah, the only reason I say, I encourage you guys listening, join the Telegram chat I posted, like actually talk to the dude. The dude's very, very smart, very, very interesting. But yeah, of course people are gonna believe that I'm just like some people are going to believe this is bullshit and that you're not who you say you are. Although listening to you talk, I don't know how you think that you want. Let's see. Azrael is a true Westerner. If you guys have any further questions before we let him go, then post them in the chat. But if not, mate, it was really good having you on. Thanks for your time. Is there anything else you want to say, promote, shout out, talk about, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming most of the people that are here are just your followers, but if anyone here who isn't following Jordan, definitely give them a follow. It was a pleasure coming here, pleasure being here, and pleasure getting to talk to you guys.
Thanks, mate. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we will talk again soon when I have more obtuse genetic engineering questions.
Yeah.
Nice one, mate. All right. Thanks very much.
No problem. See you.
In the center, if it's more creative, more energetic, more radical, more intelligent, more sassy, cooler, that's the only way it will win. The trouble with right-wing people, on the whole, is they're sort of pessimistic, and it's slightly unimaginative, and they're deeply conservative people. They're very decent people, but they're conservative. You've got to be more radical than that.